talk to you about the importance of watersheds and the important work that all of you have been doing for many years, often with very little support. And I certainly agree with the Shasta Valley RCD that your watershed groups are critical to managing at a grassroots level the many environmental, ecological, and agricultural challenges that California faces. Just a little background on me. I have a confession to make. My name's Tom, and I'm a recovering bureaucrat.
I'm sorry.
That's
good.
Thanks. And I live around the corner from you.
Yeah, we do. Good to see you, Tom.
I'm a 6-year resident of Mount Shasta, and prior to that, I was a 27-year resident of Trinity County. I retired as a principal planner in 2008 from, after 23 years with the Natural Resources Division of the Trinity County Planning Department. I now work as a consultant to a 501c3 organization that most of you probably never heard of. It's called the California Water Impact Network. We're known as CWIN. Our website is c-win.org. And I'm a water policy analyst and a media contact for the organization. By the way, nobody's paying me to be here today, so I don't have an agenda to try to brainwash you into any of our particular positions on water in California. By all definitions, I'm a water warrior. My work is rarely about collaboration, and it's usually about confrontation. I'm hoping that most of you, your work is about collaboration and not confrontation. I work on everything from the Trinity River, the Sacramento, San Joaquin Delta, San Joaquin Valley ag drainage and selenium issues. My organization is part of the No on One committee opposing the water bond, and I also work on state water project and Central Valley project issues. So even though my work is largely adversarial and confrontational, I am often thinking and working on the importance of watersheds in California, the work that you do, and trying to figure out ways to further the cause, such as getting more funding for the good work that you people do. For instance, a significant amount of my time, for those of you who know me, I spend criticizing the Trinity River Restoration Program. The main reason I actually do that is to try to force them to spend more money on watershed restoration. Again, it's not fun stuff, but somebody needs to do it. I sit on the California Advisory Committee on Salmon and Steelhead Trout, and prior to retiring in 2008, I sat on the Department of Fish and Wildlife's Peer Review Advisory Committee. So even though I'm not involved in the projects directly that your organizations are doing, I've actually voted on and approved a number of projects in the Shasta and Scott and Salmon River basins over the last several years, at least prior to 2008.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I've stuck my neck out a few times for local groups such as the Salmon River Restoration Council, trying to get their spotted knapweed eradication program funded, which didn't make the Department of Fish and Game happy, but we did get it funded at one time. I was also part of the North Coast Integrated Regional Water Management Plan process representing Trinity County. I'm not really a big fan of the IRWIM process, but I believe you have to participate if you want to get the funding. So the watersheds of Northern California and the Sierra Nevada provide most of the water for the remainder of California. Yet unfortunately, there appears to be little recognition of the importance of watersheds in terms of reinvesting in those watersheds, even though they provide the bulk of the water. They're vital for our economy and environment, which is why we all keep working on things despite the hurdles we face. My own personal story, how I came to identify with watersheds, is from my childhood. I actually grew up in Southern California, and my earliest memories were being on the playground and my lungs aching with the smog. So I was fortunate as a child to be able to go to the Sierra Nevada and spend some time in Yosemite, and I knew somebody who lived in Yosemite and spent several summers working there and learning to love the wilderness and also how to live in the woods. So in 1979, my ex-wife and I bought 17 acres in Hayfork, of all places, and by 1981 we had moved there full-time to build a house and a new life. We had become part of the drainage that we lived in called Barker Creek, which is a tributary of Jayfork Creek, because we used the creek for drinking water as well as irrigation, and there really was no other alternative there. So we were very concerned about both the flow of water in the stream as well as the quality of the water. So I actually wrote my first fishery restoration grant to the Department of Fish and Game, as it was called back then in 1983, to improve steelhead migration on Barker Creek. A nonprofit group called the South Fork Trinity Watershed Improvement Association that no longer exists sponsored the grant at the time. Back in those days, you had to have a nonprofit to sponsor your applications to the Department of Fish and Game's Fishery Restoration Grant Program. I can think of nothing better than bringing the steelhead back to the little creek that I lived on, since I loved to fish at the time. I don't anymore, but it did take about 10 years and a couple of other projects, but eventually we did get the steelhead back to Barker Creek in good numbers, and so much that my dogs even got sick from eating the dead carcasses. So it was really one of my biggest success stories that I consider. So somehow, because of the activism I was involved in, I ended up on the Trinity County Planning Commission in 1985, and by 1986, I had a full-time job as an assistant planner with the Trinity County Planning Department. And I owe all this to my ex-wife, because I didn't want to do any of those jobs, but she kept telling me that it would be a good thing for me to do. And since back then I did what she told me to do, I want to thank her publicly for the great career that I had. So I was doing regular land use planning, and incidentally, when I went to college at Santa Cruz, I took a environmental planning class, and I decided it was too much work, so I dropped out of the class, and yet somehow I ended up as a county planner. But I didn't really enjoy regular land use planning too much. So by about 1989, I managed to find a way to tap into some of the money that the Bureau of Reclamation was spending on the Trinity River Restoration Program, which probably most of you are familiar with. And subsequently, I worked for about 20 years and sponsored numerous watershed and stream restoration projects, and also worked to get the Trinity River Record of Decision adopted through the courts, raise money for the bridges and a couple of the projects on the river. And it was a great career in Trinity County, but by 2008, I was pretty much burned out. The county was having some hard times, and so I retired and moved to Mount Shasta. So suddenly I began working in the nonprofit world. So even though I did work as a bureaucrat for a number of years, I raised all of my program funds for the last 20 years that I worked for the county. So in many ways, my position was not unlike that of many of you, where you go out and raise grants for your resource conservation district or your particular watershed group. Now I work for a 501c3 that struggles with many of the same issues that you have, of how to raise funds to keep our work program going, how to keep a good attitude when things go wrong, how to have an active board of directors, and then actually to get the work done that we've raised the money for. As you all know, these are not easy things to do. Sometimes doing the projects themselves is the easiest thing, and raising the money and doing all the paperwork and environmental review takes much more time than the actual projects. So basically, I've been doing watershed restoration, fishery restoration, and environmental advocacy for over 30 years. There have been successes, but there have also been failures, colossal setbacks, embarrassments, and just plain hard times. It's not always easy. So you might ask me, well, what keeps me going? My answer to that is to rejoice humbly in the victories, even the small ones, to take care of yourself, to seek strange political bedfellows whenever possible, and to look back from where we have come to appreciate that change comes very slowly. So I was going to talk about some of these things. So rejoicing humbly. Does anybody know the 6 phases of a project? Enthusiasm, disillusionment, panic, search for the guilty, punishment of the innocent, and praise and honors for the non-participants. That's not my idea of how things should go, but if you look at many projects, that's often the case. I don't know how many times I've seen a project be dedicated and somebody will stand up there like Bruce Babbitt, and he'll go through a list of all the people who supposedly contributed to the project, but the people who did the really hard work remain unnamed. And that's just the way it is. You can't be doing these things for your own personal glory. So I think it's important that when you do have successes, that you take a few moments to appreciate them. Maybe have a party, or maybe if somebody gives you an award and you got to give an acceptance speech, thank the people that you worked with who helped you get that project done. It's not about you, it's about something larger than you are. So I think it's important to celebrate those moments because they don't happen very often, let's face it. It's an uphill battle. The other thing was to take care of yourself. Make sure you have a life. I realized early in my career that if I associated too much of myself with my work, that it was not healthy for me personally. This is not an easy thing to do, and I still struggle with it, but it's vital to distance your personal self-esteem from your work. Periodic failure is an inevitable result of trying to make change. It's wonderful when you succeed, but it can also be very devastating when you fail. So make sure you go out and do what makes you happy, whatever that is. Some words from John Muir come to mind. Climb the mountains and get their good feelings. Nature's peace will flow into you as sunshine flows into trees. The winds will blow their own freshness into you, and the storms their energy, while cares will drop off like autumn leaves. So make sure you do whatever it is that makes you happy besides your work. Don't just put everything into your work. My second recommendation is to look for those strange political bedfellows. It's important to keep an open mind and not to reject new ideas just because of the source. A lot of people that I know are like, well, if so-and-so's for that and I was against them on the Klamath Dams, so then they must be a jerk and I'm never going to agree with anything they say. Well, that's just, in my mind, not a good attitude to have. Because when you have alliances with others who you've differed with on past issues, it makes for very, very powerful coalitions. I personally enjoy most of the times when I work with my conservative friends, such as Nadine Bailey. I don't know if anybody here knows her. She used to represent Senator Olmsted. She was the president of California Women in Timber. Now she works for the Family Water Alliance, which is a group down in the valley. But she used to live in Hayfork, where I lived. And back in the mid-1990s, when the Trinity River Restoration Program needed a 3-year reauthorization from Congress, we went back to Washington and we got the bill unanimously passed through the House and the Senate under Newt Gingrich's reign as Speaker of the House. That's very powerful. I'll even work with Tom Birmingham from the Westlands Water District if I could ever find something I could agree with. Actually, earlier today, I met with the Siskiyou Daily News Editorial Board, along with Richard Marshall from the Siskiyou County Republican Central Committee, to convince the editorial board to oppose Proposition 1. So even though Rich and I came from completely different perspectives, we went and talked to the editorial board, and hopefully we convinced them. We'll see what really happens. One of my other suggestions is look back on what's been accomplished. Change is very slow, and sometimes when I get discouraged, I try to look back and see what's been accomplished over the last 30 years that I've been working on this stuff. And it's important to realize change doesn't come overnight, and persistence is necessary to implement those change. My attitude is I hope for the best, but expect the worst. Maybe that's a little pessimistic, but things don't always go the way you'd like. The way I look at it is that it's a marathon and it's not a 50-yard dash. For instance, the stream bank restoration project might take several years to evolve into the kind of desired habitat you want. Working on a watershed scale, it can take many decades for the natural processes to stabilize for things like erosion, And of course, when we're talking about salmon, multiple generations of salmon would need to return to see if you really have made a difference with your efforts in their overall populations, because obviously the fish runs fluctuate on a year-to-year basis depending on ocean conditions and other things. So what is success? And maybe some of you have some other ideas. I came up with a few things. One of them is projects and programs that achieve the desired results. Your organization is financially stable and it runs in a cost-effective manner without excessive overhead. Your board of directors is active, your staff is happy, the public supports what you do, and is there anything else that somebody can think of that I missed? Anyway, that's my definition of success. So I have some more free advice. And this may not be for everybody. This is just what's worked for me and my recommendations. One is that you should mentor others, both old and young, to ensure that your knowledge and your good work continues. None of us will live forever, and I'd like to know that some of the knowledge, values, and projects that I promoted over the years will be carried on after I'm gone. I mentored a number of AmeriCorps members over the years through the Watershed Stewards Program, and my success story is I brought Kathleen Hitt to California from Illinois. As most of you know, she's the conservation director of the Siskiyou land trust and has done a very good job at it. So I'm happy to say that I helped get her on her way. Volunteers and interns are also not only a good way to mentor people and teach them what you know, but at least in the case of the AmeriCorps Watershed Stewards Program, and I realize that funding is limited these days, but for Trinity County it was a great opportunity actually to get some cheap labor, some bright young minds to do the kind of things and to look at stuff that maybe I'd been looking at forever and didn't have the right attitude. I found actually during the last few years I was with Trinity County, most of the really significant policy research that I did or that we turned out was actually done by my AmeriCorps members, since I was buried being a bureaucrat and going to meetings and writing reports. So that's really important for the future. And the second one is to ensure cross-training of your staff and your board members. An organization that's highly dependent on a single person or a couple of people is very, very vulnerable. If something happens to that person, your organization is weakened and set back. I realize it's easier said than done to do this kind of cross-training when you have a very small staff, but it is very important. And my third and final recommendation is for organizations such as yourself, and this might be something for the RCD or others to obtain funding for, and that would be for media training for the various organizations. I strongly recommend it, and I also recommend that you have one designated person in your organization to talk to the media. A good media program can help you raise money. It can raise awareness of your issues. Public education can be a very, very valuable tool. However, saying the wrong thing to the press can destroy an organization or individuals within that organization. In the case of CWIN, we had a board member a few years ago. He was an attorney. He was a retired United Press International reporter. He was very experienced with the press, but he let his guard down with the wrong reporter. And he sat down with this reporter who basically took all of his comments out of context and created a statewide controversy to the point where he had to resign from our board, otherwise it might have destroyed our organization. And again, this was a guy who really should have known better, but you have to realize the really good reporters, no matter what they personally feel about something, their job is to sell papers. And if they can find a scandal or you saying something that's inconsistent with your organization's goals and objectives, you're gonna get creamed. So I think media training is a very important way to go. I did have a training a few years ago when I worked for Trinity County, and the one thing I remember is they showed us a video, and they showed us the Richard Nixon "I am not a crook" speech. And they said, do not ever stand up in front of a microphone like Richard Nixon did and say, "I am not a crook," because everyone will immediately assume that, in fact, you are a crook. So the media is very important for your organizations and can really help you out. For instance, and we all dream of this, is, you know, we dream that some really wealthy person will read the newspaper story about your organization and suddenly they'll bestow you with a 6-figure check. You know, I think that only happens in fairy tales, but it does happen. It just hasn't happened to my group yet. Hopefully it'll happen to your group. Anyway, I don't have really a lot much else to say, but I hope that my remarks have been some assistance to you in your noble efforts to maintain and restore our watersheds and the natural resources of Siskiyou County and the state. And thank you, all of you, very much for the important work that you do.